Next, let's move on to implement the ArtifactController class. To be more specific, let's implement the findArtifactById method. As usual, let's create a test class for ArtifactController. So here is the ArtifactController test class, and here is the class under test. Let me split up my window. We know that controller depends on service. As before, we need to define dependencies as fields. So in this case, in the test class, let's introduce artifact service. Here, you may want to use the annotation @mock to annotate this dependency. But testing a controller is a little different from testing a service. Here, we're bringing up Spring context, and let Spring IOC container inject the mock object into the controller. So here we're using a new annotation. It's called @mockBin. As you can see, this annotation is from org.springframework, and @mock is from org.mockito. So we're going to use the second one, @mockBin. Since the controller is the entry point of the entire backend, we need to mock HTTP requests using something called MockMVC. Here is how we do it. We need to annotate it using @autowired. Now it starts to complaining. It says autowired members must be defined in valid Spring Bean. So let's make this class, this ArtifactController test class, a Spring Bean. We need to annotate this test class as @springboot_test. Now MockMVC is not happy. It says could not autowire, no beans of MockMVC type found. So let's add another annotation to this class. It's called @autoconfig MockMVC. All right, then this is happy. So what happened behind the scene is once we start this test case, Spring Boot will auto-config the MockMVC and inject it into this test class. So we can use MockMVC inside this test class. Next, to make the testing a little easier, let's create a fake list of artifacts as a field. Let me also show you how to use the setup method right here. List of artifacts. Let's call it artifacts. And inside the setup, let's populate these artifacts with 6 artifacts. First, let's create an instance of the artifacts using ArrayList. To save time, I have copy and paste some code snippet to create 6 artifacts and add them to the artifacts. So copy and paste. So this setup method will get called before each test method gets called to make sure that this list is available for every test method in this test class. So this list has deluminator, invisibility cloak, Elder Wand, the Marauder's Map, the Sword of Gryffindor, and Resurrection Stone. You can find all those information from the API documentation. Okay, next, let's move to the test method right here. First, let's change the name. Test findArtifactById, and here we only focus on the success scenario. Later on, we're going to talk about the not found scenario. We'll still follow the given, when, then steps when defining a test method. In given, let's define the behavior of the mock object, artifact service. Given, and make sure we import it in, it is the second one. Given this dot artifact service dot find by ID. And let's try to find, for example, the first one, which is the deluminator. If this method gets called, then this mock will return this dot artifacts. This is a list with 6 artifacts dot get index 0. So that is the deluminator. Next, let's work on the when. Unlike testing a service object, in a controller test, we do not have to explicitly invoke the handler methods defined in a controller, because we have MockMVC. The MockMVC will perform a fake HTTP request. Since a controller test will bring up the entire Spring context, once Spring accepts the fake request, it will actually help us route it to the correct handler method. So the only thing we need to do here is to make a fake HTTP request using this dot MockMVC. And here is the syntax. This dot MockMVC dot perform. So we're going to use this perform to create a fake, in this case, HTTP GET request. And here is the syntax. GET. And we're going to pass the API endpoint URL. If my memory serves me right, the API endpoint URL of findArtifactById should be /API version 1 artifacts, and then a path parameter. In this case, copy and paste. But next, we can set a header to indicate that we're accepting media type, and make sure you pick the right one, dot application JSON. So this request says the client is accepting JSON as response. And this is the API endpoint URL. We're not done yet. Okay, so let me break line and continue. Well, here in a controller test, we kind of combine the when and then together in one long statement. So line 88 is when, that is, we're trying to invoke the target behavior. Target means the thing under test, in this case, findArtifactById. And then, starting from line 89 is the then part, the assertion part. We're comparing the actual return value in the response with the expected value. So here is the syntax. Dot. As you can see, dot, we're continuing from here. Okay, dot. And expect. Recall in the API documentation, the response example. The response is supposed to have 4 parts: flag, code, message, and data. In this success scenario, the flag should be true, code should be 200, message should be find one success, and the data in this case should be the delimiter. How do we express them here? Let me show you the syntax. JSON path, because the response is in JSON format. So we have to retrieve something from this JSON string. What do we retrieve? The first one is $.flag. That's one property of the response. And this one is supposed to be true. Okay, so it's complaining. Let's make sure we import it. Okay, so this is not the one we're looking for. Let's try again. All right, be careful. We're picking the second one. MockMVC result matches.json path. Make sure you import the correct one. Let's continue. Let me copy and paste this and expect. We have one for code, one for message, and one for data. The code is supposed to be status code dot success. The message is supposed to be find one success. So for data, since data is an object, we can refer to its field or property. For example, .id, and ID is supposed to be this one. Let's test one more. The name is supposed to be delimiter. And of course, we have to make this guy happy, because right now it's complaining. Let me make sure I import the right static method. This is not the one I'm looking for. So let me write the full name. MockMVC request builders. Okay, now it's happy. If you do not want this long name, what you can do is, let me get rid of this. And scroll all the way up to the import sections. And we can just import the static method. Okay, so here instead of importing this class, we're importing a static method, get, because that's all we need. Later on, we're going to import post, put, delete, and so on and so forth. But for now, this is happy. Now, perform is not happy because we need to handle unhandled exception. So let's do this. Add exception to method signature. Now it's happy. Okay, let's briefly go over this test case. In given, we're defining the behavior of the controller's dependency, which is artifact service. So once findById of the artifact service gets called, it will always return the delimiter. Then step 2 and step 3 are combined. We invoke the handler method findArtifactById using MockMVC. MockMVC can perform a fake HTTP GET request to this endpoint. For the then step, or the assertion, we're comparing the returned response and the expected values. That is true, success, find one success, and so on. Okay, let's start this test case. Test findArtifactById success. And no surprise, it fails. But as you can see, unlike testing the service class, testing controller actually brings up the Spring context. So Spring Boot is fired. So it takes longer time to test than the service test. Let's scroll down. And the problem is there's no value at JSON, which is expected because here in the controller, this handler method just returns null. All right, next, let's write just enough code in this findArtifactById to make the test pass. Okay, so that should be simple. The controller depends on the service to find an artifact. All right, this dot, service dot, find an artifact for me, and pass this artifact ID. So let's save the returned artifact in found artifact. Next, this handler method is going to return this found artifact to the client, and we're going to wrap it in a result object. Here we go. Return new result. And if you remember that, this result takes 4 arguments. Flag, which is true. The code should be status code dot success. And the message should be find one success. And the payload should be this found artifact, which is delimiter in this case. Okay, so make sure you're comparing what you write here against the test case. So the test case is a guidance. It guides you how to write your implementation code, because you know that this test case is going to test the code you're writing here. Okay, save. Let's launch the test case again. Now this time it passed. You see, the test case passed, which is very good. Before we move on to the next test case, which is not found, I want to talk about the line 22. Line 22 in the artifact controller. Look at line 22. It gives us an impression that the controller is returning a Java object of type result back to the client. But clearly, the client is not receiving a Java object because the front end doesn't really know how to handle Java object, right? It receives a JSON object. So what happened? Behind the scenes, before Spring MVC returns the result to the client, the Spring MVC will automatically serialize the result object into a JSON string and send this JSON string back to the client. That's what you see in the API documentation. How convenient is that? As a developer, you don't have to worry about serializing a Java object into a JSON object or a JSON string. You just return a Java object. Spring MVC will take care of the rest. Okay, now let's add another test case to consider the unhappy path, the unsuccessful scenario, not found. So let me copy and paste this to save some time. And give it a different name. Test find artifact by ID, not found. So in this case, here is the behavior of the service. If we are looking for this artifact ID, this will return, well, it's not going to return anything because do you remember, for service, once the service finds out the return value from a repository is an empty optional, it will throw an exception immediately and stop working. So if we cannot find anything from database, the service will not return anything. Instead, it will throw an exception. So, do I have will throw? Let's try it. Dot will, yes, there is, will throw. It will throw a new artifact not found exception. Okay, I'm going to pass this ID to it. So basically, the exception says, could not find artifact with ID this. All right. And apparently, we have to change the expected values. The flag would then be false, and the code should be not found, which is 404. The value of the message should be could not find artifact with ID set face. And of course, you can copy this from the service test as well. In this case, the data should be null. How do I know it? Always look at the API documentation. Okay, so here is the syntax to say this expected value is null. Dot is empty. Okay, let's start this test. Run findArtifactById, not found. No surprise, it fails. And the problem is that the service is throwing this artifact not found exception. Okay? Now, how do we handle this exception? So let's go back to the controller class. So if line 21 throws exception, that actually stops the controller from returning a result to the client. How do we handle exceptions in Spring Boot? A good practice here is that the controller is responsible for catching the exception here on line 21 and package the exception message in a result object and return it to the client. So the client knows that this ID does not exist or not found. How do we do this? Let me show you. Under System Package, right-click, new a package called Exception. Then under Exception, let's create a new Java class. And let's call it Exception Handler Advice. Let's add an annotation to it. Add REST controller advice. So inside this class, you can define many exception handlers. Right now, we only need one. That is result. And the name of the method is handle artifact not found exception. And this method takes one parameter. It is that exception. The exception that is thrown by the controller. So once this handler method captures that exception, we'll simply just return an instance of result. Now, in this case, we're going to put false as the flag, status code dot not found or 404 as the code, and the message would be the message in the exception. So ex.getMessage. And there's no need to send any payload. So by default, the payload, the data, will be null. So that's it. So very simple. But here's a question. How do we let Spring know that we want to use this handler method, this handle artifact not found exception, to handle the artifact not found exception? Now remember, The computers are not smart. The name only makes sense to human beings, to developers like you and me. But Spring does not know this method is supposed to handle this one by just looking at the name. We have to tell Spring. How? Using annotations. Okay, so we're going to use annotation called @exceptionHandler to tell Spring that this method is an exception handler so I have to pass a value to it. It handles artifact not found exception.class. So basically it says, hey Spring, if you capture or encounter this artifact not found exception, just pass it to me, let me handle it. And what I would do is to package this exception in a result and return it to the client. And of course, before returning to the client, just like the controller, Spring MVC will serialize this result object into JSON string. As you can see, the REST controller advice is very similar to a REST controller. Optionally, here you can also send back the status code in the header of the response. Here is response status. I'm going to send back HTTP status. Let's find N. It's right here. Not found. Okay. Here is a little redundant. This one is in the HTTP response header, while this one we define it by ourselves. This is in the response body. So in this case, it is redundant. But as I said before, if your company has some custom status codes, then this field here is very handy. Okay, that's all. That's all you need to do. There's no need to change the code in the controller. If line 21 throws an exception, then this exception handler device will kick in and handle that exception and return a not found result. Okay, let's test. As you can see, the test passes. In the end, I want to make a comment about this test-driven development approach, or TDD, or red-green refactor, whatever you want to call it. Many people think writing tests is wasting time, but think about this. When you are writing a test method, you are actually thinking about how to write code to pass the test. So this is not a waste of time. Thinking about test cases first will actually help you come up with a robust solution because you already know what will be tested. You have already considered all the happy paths and unhappy paths and even some corner cases.